So our final video of our protein series, how much protein should you eat? The RDA, which is the amount needed to prevent disease, is set at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. So if you weigh 150 pounds, we'll convert the 150 pounds to kilograms, which is 68 kilograms, times 0.8, which is the RDA for protein intake, and we get 55 grams of protein per day. And I want you to think about the RDA as your minimum because there's significant evidence that just meeting the RDA day to day isn't going to optimize a lot of those benefits that we talked about in our previous video. So if you weigh 150 pounds, 55 grams of protein per day would be your minimum. The true protein recommendation for most people is somewhere between 1.2 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. So that same 150-pound person would likely need to eat between 88 and 150 grams of protein daily to maximize those protein benefits. This range seems really big because there's a lot of factors that go into determining where you specifically should sit within that range. If you're trying to lose weight and you're in a calorie deficit, your intake should be closer to the higher end. If you're an athlete, your intake should also be closer to the higher end. And lastly, if you're elderly, your intake should be closer to the higher end as well. So let's go through each of those scenarios. So first, if you're trying to lose weight, you need a higher protein intake because, of course, the weight you're trying to lose is body fat, not muscle. Having a higher protein intake and consistently performing resistance training is going to help your body retain the muscle that it has. And while you're in a calorie deficit, your body is going to lose fat rather than muscle. If you're new to resistance training or strength training, you're actually kind of lucky because you have the potential to gain muscle while losing fat. But that's only if you consistently resistance train and have an adequate protein intake. This, of course, can get really challenging because you're trying to reduce your calorie intake, you're trying to lower the amount of food that you're eating, but your protein needs go up. So you really have to prioritize high protein foods and lower calorie high protein foods to make sure that you're still in a calorie deficit where you can lose weight, but getting enough protein where you're not losing muscle. But remember, you still need carbohydrates and fat, so don't neglect the other macronutrients. Next, athletes. Athletes place a higher demand on their body and their muscle tissue, so they really have to make sure that they have enough protein around and thus those individual amino acids that your body can use those amino acids to help repair any of the damage that the body goes through training and help build it back up bigger and stronger in the long run. The type of sport or activity that you do, your training regimen, and your goals will all help determine where within that recommendation range that you should set for your protein intake each day. And then third, the elderly. This is probably the most surprising for most people. The elderly actually have really high protein needs. This is because of several reasons. One, in the elderly, the body has a less ability to digest and absorb protein. Two, there's a decreased ability to induce muscle protein synthesis, the process needed to repair muscle. And three, there's an increased likelihood for sarcopenia, that age-related muscle loss that we talked about. It's very common for appetite to be decreased in the elderly, so this is another population that really has to prioritize protein intake. Drinking a daily homemade high-protein smoothie or shake might help ensure that they're getting adequate nutrients and protein. In general, it's easier for people that have a decreased appetite to drink their calories rather than trying to get it from solid foods. So can you eat too much protein? Remember, protein does have calories, meaning that the body can use it to make energy, so eating too much protein could lead to weight gain. Eating too much of anything could lead to weight gain. Having a high protein intake might compromise digestion. It might induce constipation or diarrhea, especially if fiber intake isn't adequate. But just like we talked about in our third video, having a high protein intake will not damage otherwise healthy kidneys or bones. Go back and watch that third video on protein myths for more details.